The corridors stretched out in silence, lined with polished steel and quiet, humming walls. Elon Musk walked its length alone, listening to voices through his earpiece, technical, precise, void of emotion. It was a report on SpaceX's new emotional AI interface designed to support astronauts during long-duration missions to Mars. But something in the voices felt empty. He stopped outside the simulation chamber and glanced through the glass. Inside, a test subject sat in mock isolation, surrounded by screens and AI-generated landscapes. The artificial voice responded promptly to his questions. Its tone was calm, unchanging, polite. But when the subject spoke about missing home, about the ache of absence, the AI replied, "Your emotional state has been noted. You are within operational norms." Elon frowned. It was technically correct, and deeply wrong. From behind him came the quiet voice of Dr. Evelyn Grace, the lead human factors engineer on the project. A woman of steady hands and soulful eyes, Evelyn had spent years studying the psychological effects of space travel. She stepped beside him and murmured, "They don't need logic, Elon. They need music." Her words stayed with him. Later, back in his car, Elon scrolled through his music library. A familiar tune caught his eye, "Don't Worry Baby" by the Beach Boys. He let it play, leaning back as the harmonies flooded the silence. His eyes closed. For a moment, he wasn't a tech visionary or a CEO or a man with the weight of planets on his shoulders. He was just a boy, remembering something he hadn't realized he'd forgotten. At the next meeting, a NASA psychologist presented a troubling graph. Anxiety levels among astronauts were highest not during launch or re-entry, but in the long, quiet hours of nothingness. AI keeps them alive, the psychologist said, but music reminds them they're human. Elon scribbled it into his notebook. Music reaches where machines cannot. That night, he wandered the starbase alone. The halls were empty, echoing like old cathedrals. Through his wireless earbuds, he played dusty recordings, vinyl tracks digitized decades ago. There was a scratchy warmth in the sound, imperfections that made the experience more human. He passed closed doors, humming in my room under his breath. Back at his desk, he opened a clean page in his notebook. Project, Interstellar Sound Museum. What does human love sound like? He knew AI couldn't answer that. It could replicate chords, generate melodies, mimic emotion. But it couldn't feel. It couldn't ache. It couldn't remember its mother's voice in the kitchen or a summer song on a dusty cassette in the back seat of a car. An engineer proposed they generate the capsule's soundtrack using AI composition. It would be efficient, mathematically pleasing. Elon refused. He stared out the window toward the stars. "What makes a song last?" he whispered to no one. "Why do some survive while others disappear?" A memory returned. His childhood home in South Africa. His mother, May, playing records in the living room, softer tunes that filled the late afternoon with color. He remembered not the words, but the feeling. The way the music seemed to know him, even before he knew himself. He had spent his life building things that worked. Rockets, cars, satellites. But if he was going to send something into the stars to speak for all of us, it couldn't just function. It had to mean something. And that was something he couldn't build alone. He thought of the Beach Boys, of the voice behind the songs that held him, unknowingly, across the decades. Brian Wilson, a man who had written melodies that cradled pain and wrapped it in light, who understood harmony not as technique, but as emotion layered in sound. Elon pulled out a sheet of paper, real paper, and wrote a letter. Handwritten, no assistants, no intermediaries. Just him, reaching out not to a legend, but to a man who had spoken to him long before they'd ever met. "Dear Brian, my name is Elon Musk. I know we come from very different worlds, but I believe those worlds may touch each other in the space between music and memory. I'm working on something unusual, something deeply human. I need your help. Not to design, not to engineer, but to feel, to remember, to guide. Would you meet with me? There's something I want to send into the stars, and I think only you can help me tune its heart." He sealed the letter in a plain envelope. No SpaceX logo, No formality, just a return address and a hope. Days passed. Then came the reply, not through publicists or agents, but in the quiet ring of a personal phone call. "Elon," a voice rasped. "Yes," Elon said, holding his breath. "This thing you're doing, it's strange," Brian said. "But so was Pet Sounds. And I think I'd like to hear more." And in that single imperfect human reply, there it was, the beginning of a song that hadn't yet been written. Dear viewer, if this story stirred something in you, something tender, something that reminded you of a memory or a song long tucked away, consider leaving a note below. A thought, a song that shaped you, or simply a few kind words. And if you'd like to stay close to stories like this, where the human heart is always the hero, you're warmly invited to subscribe. Around here, we don't just tell stories. We listen to them too. The house sat quietly on a palm-lined street in Los Angeles, just far enough from the ocean that the waves couldn't be heard, but close enough that the salt still hung in the air. From the outside, it looked like any other home. Aged stucco walls, a narrow porch shaded by a wind-bent eucalyptus. But inside, the silence was different. It wasn't the absence of noise. It was the presence of memory. Brian Wilson, now in his 80s, moved slowly through the halls of that house. His fingers brushed the edge of a dusty upright piano, then paused over a sun-faded record sleeve leaning against a shelf. There were instruments in every room, guitars without strings, a theremin that hadn't been touched in years, a Wurlitzer with its keys worn smooth. They didn't make music anymore, but they remember it. It had been years since Brian had performed publicly. The world outside had grown faster, louder, more artificial. And while people still spoke his name with reverence, he preferred the quiet now. He lived surrounded by echoes, not applause. Then came the letter. Delivered not by courier, but tucked respectfully into the hands of Gloria, his longtime assistant, the envelope was plain. No logo, no branding, just his name, handwritten in firm, deliberate strokes. From Elon Musk, Gloria said, her tone cautious. He wrote it himself. Brian didn't open it right away. He held the envelope in his lap for almost an hour, staring at the handwriting. Finally, he opened it, unfolding the letter, like it might disintegrate in his hands. The words inside were simple, an invitation, a request. Elon Musk was working on something that had to do with Mars, music, and meaning. He wanted Brian's help, not to engineer or approve. To feel, to guide. Brian read the letter 3 times. Then, for the first time in years, he pulled out the old headphones from a drawer, plugged them into a vintage turntable, and played Surf's Up. The notes were familiar but heavier somehow, like looking into a mirror and seeing not your face, but your younger self's hopes reflected back, cracked and softened. He closed his eyes and listened, really listened, and something in him stirred. "Why me?" he muttered aloud to no one. But the question lingered, unanswered, even as the final harmonies faded into static. A week passed. The letter stayed on his piano. He thought about it every day. Then one morning, he called Gloria into the room and said, "Tell him yes. I'll meet him, but somewhere quiet." The meeting was arranged discreetly, no headlines, no cameras. They chose a cafe near Santa Monica Pier, tucked into a side street, the kind of place where people brought books and old friends. Elon arrived first, sitting at an outdoor table with his notebook open but untouched. When Brian arrived, walking slowly, carefully, Elon stood, visibly nervous. He extended a hand. Brian took it. The touch was brief but meaningful. They sat. Elon tried to explain the project. A musical capsule to be launched into deep space, a vessel of emotion, of memory, something that might one day be found by someone or something far from Earth. He spoke of interstellar missions, psychological strain, the way silence in space can echo inside a person's mind. Brian listened patiently, his eyes thoughtful. Then he asked softly, "And what about the heart? Do you know what it sounds like?" The question hit Elon harder than he expected. He paused, then replied honestly, "No, but I want to." Brian nodded, as if that was the only answer that mattered. He leaned back in his chair. Then don't study it. Don't calculate it. Just listen. That became their agreement. For the next 7 nights, Elon would come to Brian's home, and they would listen, not to ideas, but to records. One each night. The first night, Brian chose pet sounds. They sat in the dim living room, no lights except the soft glow of a vintage lamp. Brian didn't speak until the final track ended. Then he said, "There's fear in there. And hope. I put it all in. That's why it lasts." Elon was silent, absorbing that. "What makes a song survive time?" he asked. Brian's answer came like a sigh. Pain, hope, and harmony. That's what people carry. That's what makes it stay. On the third night, Brian played a tape of discarded demos, unpolished, raw, some off-key. "These were too vulnerable," he said, "so they never got released. But sometimes they feel more real than the hits." Elon began to understand something he never had before. Vulnerability wasn't a flaw in music. It was the soul of it. The cracking voice, the imperfect take, the silence between chords. By the 6th night, Elon was taking notes less and feeling more. He spoke of his own childhood, how his mother used to hum while cooking, how certain songs made him feel like he was back in that kitchen, barefoot on tile, the world safe and warm. Brian listened quietly and then said, "Before you send anything out there, you need to understand what stayed here, what endured. Not because it was perfect, but because it meant something." On the 7th night, Brian brought out a list. Not of songs, but of memories. The first time he heard harmony in his brother's voices. The day he wrote "God Only Knows" and felt like he wasn't alone. The sound of a girl crying to a Beach Boys song at a concert because it reminded her of her father. He looked at Elon and said, "That's where your capsule begins. In those sounds." Together, they began curating the first draft of the playlist, not for scientific accuracy, but for emotional gravity. Lullabies, love songs, broken-hearted confessions, children laughing, the ocean, vinyl scratches, a sound capsule not just of Earth, but of being human. That night, as Elon left the house, the list folded in his hand, Brian watched him go. The moon hung low over the palms, casting long shadows across the yard. He closed the door slowly, the sound echoing faintly behind him. And for the first time in years, Brian sat down at his piano and played. The sun rose over the Texas desert in a slow, golden wash. Inside the main conference room at Starbase, the walls were covered in whiteboards and screens, but today, the room felt more like a conservatory than a lab. Elon Musk had gathered an unusual group: neuroscientists, musicologists, linguists, engineers, and one silent observer sitting at the far end of the table, Brian Wilson. A question hung in the air. What should go into the capsule? Elon asked quietly, tapping a marker against his notebook. "We're sending it beyond Mars. It might float for centuries. What message do we want to leave behind? What sound of humanity?" The experts offered theories. A universal scale, songs in major keys, linguistic simplicity, historical representation, algorithmic variety. Brian, who had listened for nearly an hour without speaking, finally raised his hand with a slight motion. His voice was soft, but it silenced the room. "It's not about what they understand," he said, "it's about what they feel." Some in the room exchanged glances. Elon, however, leaned forward. Brian continued, his fingers drumming gently on the table. "Music isn't just language. It's vibration, memory, grief, hope. Sometimes it doesn't make sense, it just stays with you." A pause. So maybe we stop asking, "What's logical?" and start asking, "What lingers?" There was a long, thoughtful silence. Later that afternoon, Elon and Brian stood outside, looking out at the open desert. Dust moved gently across the horizon, like a memory trying to settle. "There's a debate," Elon said quietly, "about whether we should use AI to select the final tracks. Let the algorithm scan all music ever made. Rank it. Filter by tempo, emotion, accessibility." Brian just smiled, not in disagreement, but in understanding. "You can do that," he said, "but you'll get a list, not a soul." To illustrate, He led Elon into a nearby town where they slipped, unnoticed, into a small mission-style church. The air inside was still and warm, scented with old wood and faint wax. Sunlight streamed through dusty windows. Brian walked straight to the small organ at the front. It was a humble instrument worn with time. He sat down without hesitation, pressing a few keys with care, letting the low tones resonate into the sanctuary. Some sounds, he said softly, aren't meant to be measured. Some live here. He placed a hand over his chest, and nowhere else. The music was imperfect. One key stuck slightly, and the reverb came more from a hollow space than the pipes themselves. But it was beautiful in a way that no machine could recreate. Elon sat in the front pew, silent, thinking of every algorithm he'd ever trusted, every clean solution, every graph that predicted behavior. They had all worked, but they had never moved anyone. That night, he sent a message to his engineering team. "We're doing this differently," he wrote. "No ranking systems, no filters, only real people choosing what they remember." The next week, a young woman named Talia was invited to the studio. She had a warm, untrained voice, raw, open, luminous. Her eyes were large and still, her guitar slightly out of tune. But when she sang a stripped-down version of "You've Got to Hide Your Love Away," no one spoke afterward. Even the sound technicians left the booth wiping their eyes. Brian turned to Elon and said simply, "You feel that? No AI can." Then came the moment that marked a turning point for Elon. One evening, a group of volunteers was invited to perform acoustic renditions of songs that had shaped their lives. Among them was a girl named Rachel, just 16. She was blind since birth, but her pitch was flawless. Her choice. "In my room." As she sang, the room stilled. The air thickened with something ancient, nostalgia, maybe, or sorrow, or gratitude for things we don't even know we've lost. Brian sat at the edge of his seat, eyes brimming. He whispered to Elon, "I wrote that when I was afraid, and she's turning it into shelter." Elon picked up his notebook and wrote quietly, "Maybe the future needs more of the past." Over the next few weeks, they began testing the emotional impact of songs on astronauts in isolation training. The subjects listened to selected tracks during extended sessions, simulating Martian travel. The data was undeniable. Songs with layered harmonies, particularly those with multiple human voices, showed consistent drops in cortisol, improved mood, and increased connection to self. Elon, astonished, asked Brian why. "Because voices together remind us we're not alone," Brian said. "Even if the words don't mean anything, they mean something together." Something shifted in Elon after that. He began recording small voice memos for his children, nothing formal, just him speaking gently over quiet background music. Little messages, in case they ever wanted to hear his voice in the stillness of space. Something to carry home. And then one morning, the name came to him while walking the grounds in the early light. He texted Brian just one word. "Echoes." Then a second. "Beyond." Then a final. "The shore." Brian called him within minutes. "That's it," he said. "That's what we're building. Echoes beyond the shore. Not a playlist, not a museum. A vessel of memory. A bridge between what's felt and what's forgotten." By now, the capsule had shape. It would be small, yes, but carefully crafted. Songs from different cultures. Lullabies, symphonies, field recordings. Voices in unison. Moments of silence. And beneath it all, the guiding principle wasn't technical perfection. It was resonance. Frequencies you can't see. Notes you don't hear with your ears, but with your life. And for the first time, Elon wasn't asking the universe to listen. He was learning to listen to it. The capsule had begun to take shape. Not physically, it was still months from final design, but in spirit, in texture, in tone. It had stopped being a project and started becoming a memory. Elon Musk sat at a wide table scattered with recordings, some vinyl, some digital files, some analog cassette tapes now carefully digitized. He played back an old field recording, bicycle bells in Amsterdam, followed by the faint laughter of children, followed by the hiss of ocean waves breaking over rocks. He paused the track, thoughtful. What if we included this? He said aloud. Brian Wilson, sitting in the same room with a notepad on his knee, looked up from a line of lyrics he was sketching. You mean the laughter? Or the bells? All of it, Elon said. Not just music. The little things, the forgotten sounds. The ones that remind you you're alive. Brian smiled. The things machines never think to save. He leaned back, gaze softening. What makes us human lives in the details. A door creaking open. Wind in the curtains. Someone calling your name from the next room. Elon noted the words. Not for analysis, just to hold them. Like one holds a feather that drifts past on a quiet day. As the soundscape expanded, they came to another crossroad. Should they include songs of sadness? Elon hesitated. Wouldn't it be better to fill the capsule with hope? Brian looked at him without blinking. There's no hope without sorrow. If you don't include sadness, you're only sending half the truth. Elon leaned back, quiet. He knew Brian was right. Within days, they added a new layer to the archive. Minor key ballads, lullabies sung in grief, wordless humming recorded at hospital bedsides. Not just pain, beauty through pain. The kind that doesn't seek to be explained, only felt. That was when the story got out. A leaked memo, a whisper in the music community. Then headlines, Elon Musk and Brian Wilson collaborate on a musical capsule for space. The reaction was immediate and electric. Beach Boys fans flooded forums, sending messages of awe, curiosity, and sometimes concern. Is Brian okay? Will we get to hear what they're making? This is the most beautiful, weird news I've read in years. Reporters circled. Offers for interviews came in waves. Elon declined them all. He looked at Brian and said, "Let the music speak for us." It always did better than words. To protect the sanctity of their work, most of the creative sessions moved to Brian's home, his modest sanctuary filled with pianos, mixing boards, and framed stillness. It was there, in the quiet of those afternoons, that Brian opened a drawer long forgotten. Inside were 3 composition books, worn at the edges, pages yellowed with time. Old stuff, he said, brushing dust with his sleeve. Things I never finished. Things I was too afraid to. Elon took them gently. May I read them? Only if you promise not to fix them. The notebooks were like reading a diary written in chords, unfinished melodies, scribbled lyrics, emotional sketches. One page simply read, "Alone in a full room. Still can't sing it." Another, "Harmony like home. But no one home." They spoke for hours that week about loneliness. Marte will be quiet, Elon admitted. Colder than anything we've ever known. Not just in temperature, in absence. Brian nodded. You can build rockets, but you can't engineer away loneliness. Not really. Elon stared at the notes, suddenly understanding what he'd been trying to do his entire life. Invent away the ache. He put on Wouldn't It Be Nice that night. Not through headphones, but aloud in Brian's studio. He sat with his head bowed, eyes closed. The harmonies rose like morning light, tender and full of longing. It was the voice of a younger world, dreaming of something kinder. When the song ended, Elon said nothing. He didn't need to. Brian went to his piano the next morning and began something new. It was slow, thoughtful, just piano and breath. No lyrics, not yet. He recorded it onto reel tape. A single take. Elon took that recording to a children's home on the outskirts of town the following week. No announcement, no press, just him, a small speaker, and permission to share something gentle. He played Brian's unfinished melody for a group of kids sitting cross-legged on the floor. Some danced, some sat in a trance. One boy cried and couldn't explain why. A girl asked if she could hear it again before bed. When Elon returned to Brian, his eyes were glassy. "I think I get it now," he said. "It's not about what we launch. It's about what they carry." And so, the capsule shifted once more. It now had a core, childhood, love, and longing. They began collecting sounds not just from archives, but from their own lives. Brian suggested they record the ocean again, not digitally, but by placing a microphone in the sand, just as the tide changed. Elon added the suggestion, the laughter of his own children, unposed and real. Wind rustling through trees outside the family cabin. The creak of a swing. It became less a project and more a time capsule of the emotional body, something future beings or distant travelers might recognize not with their minds, but with their hearts. "This isn't technology anymore," Brian said, watching the waveforms on the screen as the children's laughter was edited into the master file. "This is a legacy." Elon turned to him and nodded. "We're not just sending sound," he said. "We're sending memory." And in that quiet room filled with laughter, chords, and wind, they realized something simple but profound. They weren't building a machine. They were building a human echo. The lab had never been this quiet. The large room at Starbase, once dominated by technical chatter and algorithmic debates, now pulsed with something more fragile: expectation. At the center stood a matte black chamber, sealed like a vault. Inside it, a prototype of the Interstellar Capsule was undergoing final sound transmission tests, compressing thousands of hand-picked sounds and songs into formats resilient enough to survive radiation, vacuum, and time. And yet, Elon couldn't help but feel it might all vanish with a single glitch. Brian Wilson stood next to him, arms crossed lightly over his cardigan. He watched the digital meters rise and fall with curiosity, not anxiety. His calm contrasted sharply with Elon's unease. "How do we preserve the original warmth?" Elon asked. "Every compression strips something away. The hiss, the breath, the imperfection." Brian chuckled softly. "The imperfection is the soul, Elon. That's what we can't afford to lose." They had run the files through 6 different processes. AI cleaned, analog rebalanced, digitally warmed. But none sounded exactly like what they had heard in that sunlit studio or the chapel or the orphanage. Then came the stutter. A soft warning tone blinked red across the console. One of the master files, the one containing the children's voices layered with piano, had corrupted. A backup existed, but not the raw take. That version had something none of the others did. Elon's hands tensed on the console. His shoulders dropped. "It's gone," the technician said. "The original session was overwritten 2 versions ago." Elon stared at the monitor. "We just lost something irreplaceable." Brian walked slowly over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "If it mattered," he said quietly, "we'll sing it again." Elon didn't respond, but something in him let go. In the days that followed, he began to regard the music differently. Not as content, not as product, but as something alive. A living organism that changed in the telling, that could survive damage and be reborn in a different voice, a different room, a different time. The capsule wasn't a vault. It was a garden. One afternoon, a retired astronaut, Colonel Maya Hart, visited the lab. She had spent 16 months on the International Space Station and 3 more in lunar orbit. A woman of few words, she stood beside the speaker array and listened without comment as Brian's Warmth of the Sun played softly through the simulated vacuum transmission. When it ended, she remained still for a long moment. Then she spoke, eyes damp. "That," she said, "was what I lost out there. Not Earth, not gravity, that warmth." Neither Brian nor Elon said a word. That evening, Brian scribbled something on a yellow notepad. "Music is what home sounds like when you're too far away to call." It was Elon who suggested a new addition to the capsule. Handwritten letters from strangers, notes about love, longing, and unspoken goodbyes. Brian lit up at the idea. Let them write the verses. They opened a call for submissions quietly. No advertising, no public campaign. Just a quiet invitation to write a note for someone you loved and lost. The letters poured in. A woman in Kyoto wrote to her sister who had died in childbirth. A widower in Argentina sent a poem he had recited to his wife every year on their anniversary. A child in Nairobi sent a drawing of a bird singing in a tree with a voice bubble, "Come back soon." Each letter was scanned, read aloud by volunteers, and layered with soft ambient tones, ocean waves, leaves rustling, clocks ticking in empty rooms. It became a segment of the capsule titled Echoes of the Unspoken. Then came the lullabies. Schools and families across the world were invited to share traditional nanas, bedtime songs sung by generations. It didn't matter if they were off-key or in dialects no longer spoken. What mattered was who sang them and why. Children from Morocco, Finland, Mexico, Nepal, and dozens of other places sent recordings. Some sung by grandmothers, some hummed by fathers, some accompanied by hand claps, some in total silence. Elon sat alone one evening, listening to a lullaby in Ukrainian. The child singing couldn't have been older than 5. The voice trembled at the start, then found its rhythm. Elon closed his eyes. "This isn't a project anymore," he whispered. "It's a prayer." He visited Brian's house the next day. It was the same as always, small, modest, quiet. No visible signs of fame. Just shelves of vinyl, walls of instruments, and the smell of coffee brewing too long. He noticed, not for the first time, how little there was in terms of decoration or indulgence. Just sound and time. They had lunch on the porch, grilled cheese and tomato soup, and said little. The wind whispered through the eucalyptus trees. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once and fell silent again. Brian finished his soup and stood. "I have one more thing." He led Elon into a small back room with a piano that had gone slightly out of tune. On the bench was a single sheet of music, half-written. "I never finished it," Brian said. "I don't think I should." He sat down and began to play. The melody was simple, repeating, unresolved. It rose and fell like waves too tired to crash. There were no words, only something that felt like the last line of a letter no one had finished writing. He looked at Elon as the final note faded. "For when there's no one left to listen," he said. That became the final track. Except it wasn't. On the morning the capsule was sealed, Elon added something. A sound he had recorded in secret days before. Brian's heartbeat. Captured with a small chest microphone, it was clear, slow, steady. Not dramatic, just human. The final layer of the capsule was silence, then the slow rhythm of life, then silence again. As the engineers closed the casing, Elon stood by and said, more to himself than to anyone else, "It's lighter than anything we've ever launched." Then, after a long breath, and heavier than everything. It was late morning at SpaceX when the capsule was formally presented to the core team, the engineers, psychologists, acousticians, linguists, and mission planners who had spent months orbiting the project but had never quite seen or heard a whole. Now it sat on a pedestal in the center of the conference hall. Sleek, no bigger than a basketball, matte and silent, yet carrying within it 1,000 lifetimes of feeling. Brian Wilson stood at Elon Musk's side, both men unusually still, like fathers on the eve of a graduation neither had imagined. The room was quiet as the lights dimmed, and the first transmission was played, not through speakers, but through deep space simulators designed to replicate how the capsule would sound when echoed back in the void between planets. A soft ocean wave, children laughing, then a slow, wordless lullaby sung in a language no one in the room understood. When the last note faded, no one clapped. The silence wasn't awkward, it was reverent. A young engineer, barely in her 30s, whispered as if speaking to herself, "I never thought my dad's whistling would end up in a space mission." She wiped her eye and turned to Brian, who gave her a nod that said more than words ever could. After the session, Elon stayed behind to observe the first closed-circuit transmission test. The signal was sent through vacuum simulation chambers, re-encoded, and replayed through an external relay node, just as it would be when orbiting Mars or farther. The music returned distorted, but intact, faint, as if remembered rather than heard. Brian listened, and then turned to Elon. "There it is," he said softly. Elon, eyes fixed on the waveform dancing across the monitor, replied, almost inaudibly, "Now, there's something human out there." Within a week, reports began to surface from simulation labs. Astronauts undergoing long-duration isolation training showed marked improvements in psychological benchmarks when allowed to listen to the capsule's contents. Resting heart rates decreased, sleep patterns normalized, feelings of emotional detachment common in long-term space conditioning were softened. One technician summarized it best: they stopped feeling like passengers on a mission. They started feeling like people again. Brian listened to the data with the same expression he had listening to a string section tune up, attentive, but never surprised. "We're not saving the body," he said, "but maybe we're saving the spirit." The media caught on soon after. "The Soul of Earth in Orbit," one headline read. What Elon Musk and Brian Wilson are sending into space isn't just sound, it's memory. Read another. A young journalist asked Elon during a brief interview, "What do you feel when you listen to the capsule?" Elon paused. The usual answers, innovation, pride, engineering excellence, dissolved before they reached his mouth. "Things I don't know how to name yet," he said quietly. Brian heard about the interview and chuckled. "That means it's working." A few days later, Brian invited Elon to join him on a visit to a care home in Pasadena. It was a modest place with faded wallpaper and soft slippers echoing on tile floors. A weekly gathering of residents held casual music nights, sometimes live, sometimes recorded, mostly nostalgic. This evening, a small speaker played Surfer Girl, slowed just slightly for clarity. The room changed. One elderly woman, silent for weeks according to the staff, began to hum along. Then she sang. Not perfectly, but clearly. The nurses froze. Brian reached over and touched Elon's arm, his voice almost proud. Sometimes what's lost isn't really gone, it's just waiting for the right song. Elon recorded the moment on his phone, later transferring the audio directly into the capsule's archive. It became known internally as Track 243 Return. That night, he sat at his desk at home with a stack of blank cards and a black ink pen. No screens, no data, just him and the weight of everything they had captured. He began to write. To whomever may hear this, these songs carried us when we didn't know where else to go. Another. If this ever reaches you, know that we tried. We laughed. We missed each other. We sang about it. And then a final one, folded in half, placed in the capsule's physical chamber. If someone hears this someday, let them know we loved. And we sang about it. He didn't sign them. He didn't have to. The capsule was no longer a technological artifact. It was a letter, one sealed not with wax, but with melody. The project began as a response to isolation, a way to anchor the human mind during months and years adrift in space. But it had become something else. It was a bridge between the ones who left and the ones who stayed, between memory and motion, between the silence of orbit and the noise of childhood. And though Elon had built rockets and Brian had built songs, this was something neither could have built alone. A machine that carried what machines could not understand. The weight of a song. The capsule was no longer a theory. No longer a dream passed between hands like a fragile cord. It was now latched to the outer hull of a spacecraft in Earth's low orbit, real, pressurized, humming softly with recorded life. Sensors surrounded it, measuring electromagnetic resonance, pulse response, even micro variations in the cabin's atmosphere. But it wasn't the machinery that everyone was watching. It was the crew. For this test flight, SpaceX had selected 4 astronauts, 2 veterans and 2 newcomers, each with extensive experience in isolation and psychological training. What they hadn't prepared for was how the music would land on them in the quiet. The capsule schedule was simple. At predetermined intervals, it would release carefully timed tracks, songs from the global archive, whispers of lullabies, laughter, breathing, the creak of an old chair, ocean waves. The results, even from the first 24 hours, startled the team back on Earth. Vitals stabilized. Anxiety levels, measured through cortisol patterns and pulse variation, dropped significantly. Sleep patterns improved. One of the astronauts, a young Brazilian named Camila Duarte, submitted a video log on the 3rd day. Her face was soft in the screen's glow, her voice slower than usual. "I was brushing my hair," she said, "and suddenly a song came on, a Spanish lullaby I hadn't heard since I was 4. I don't even know how it made it in, but it was like someone from home had reached across the dark and held me. I cried. I didn't want it to stop." She paused. "I didn't feel alone anymore." Brian listened to that recording with his eyes closed, his hands resting on the arms of his chair. When it ended, he turned to Elon and said almost as if to himself, "It worked." That night, he began to write again. The piano keys were slower under his fingers now, the chords spaced farther apart. But there was clarity in the melody that hadn't been there before. He titled it Beyond the Blue. "I want this one," he told Elon, "to be my goodbye. Even if I'm still here. Sometimes a real goodbye is just a slow echo you leave behind." Elon said nothing. He simply set up a vintage ribbon microphone in the center of the room and let Brian play under dim, amber light. No second takes, no isolation booth, just the piano, the man, the air between them. When the final note faded, Elon left the recorder running a few seconds longer. The silence said more than any lyric could. "Why the analog setup?" Elon asked quietly. Brian smiled. "Because recording like this, it's like leaving a letter in a coat pocket. One day, someone finds it, and it still speaks." A few days later, Elon introduced a new concept to the project, emotional confessions. He asked for voice submissions from around the world, short messages from people who wanted to say something they never could while the person was still around. Apologies, thank yous, final goodbyes. They poured in. A woman in Ohio whispered, "I forgive you, Dad. Even now." A young man in Senegal said, "Thank you, Mama. I made it to college because you believed in me." A grandmother in Seoul recorded herself saying, "I never stopped waiting for your letter." Brian listened to one of the messages, a husband saying goodbye to his late wife of 40 years, and lowered his head. He didn't cry aloud, but a tear rolled quietly down the side of his face, and Elon said nothing, only placed a hand gently on the older man's shoulder and stayed there. Then came a message no one had expected. A children's hospital in Rome had been playing a few of the early test tracks for its young patients. One child, Lucia, 5 years old, fighting leukemia, had listened to a song and laughed, not a giggle, but a full, delighted, belly-deep laugh. It had been recorded without her knowing. The sound was bright and unfiltered, like glass catching sunlight. When Brian heard it, he pressed the earphones to his head and sat back, smiling. "She has more light in her than most people I've known," he said softly. That laugh became one of the final tracks in the capsule's inner core, labeled only as Lucia. Elon later had an idea. What if mothers all over the world could sing to the stars? He issued an open request, discreet and tender. If you have a lullaby, one that's been sung in your family for generations, record it. No need for perfection, just your voice, your love. The replies came in every language imaginable. One stood out. A woman from Chile, aged 79, recorded herself singing a song in Mapudungun, a language nearly lost. The song had been passed down from her grandmother, who had never traveled beyond the village. She sang it to a grandson she had never met, born after her daughter left for Europe and never returned. At the end of the recording, the woman whispered, "Para ti, nieto, donde si que estés." For you, grandson, wherever you are. Brian and Elon listened together. Neither spoke. There were no words needed. By now, the capsule was something else entirely. It was no longer just a message for alien life or a therapy tool for astronauts. It had become a mirror reflecting the best of what it meant to be human, not polished or idealized, but fragile, aching, enduring. Not just a gift to space, but a gift to us. And as Elon watched the capsule orbit silently above Earth, full of laughter, loss, and lullabies, he understood. They hadn't sent music into space. They had sent love. The air in Pretoria was warmer than Elon remembered. The sun didn't press down as it once had. It merely rested above the rooftops, slow and quiet. The house where he grew up was empty now. No furniture, no footsteps. Just hollow echoes of a childhood long sealed away. He moved slowly through the hallway, fingers grazing the white walls, each touch stirring flashes of memory. His mother's voice calling him for dinner, the clink of tools on the floor, the buzz of a homemade radio whirring to life under his boyish hands. In a forgotten drawer of his old bedroom, beneath a box of broken wires and matchbox cars, he found it, a compact cassette tape with faded ink on the label. For Elon, Sleep Songs 1983. His breath caught. He brought it back to California, digitized it himself, and played it once, just once. His mother's voice, younger and melodic, singing softly in Afrikaans. A lullaby with a slightly wavering tone, as if she'd been smiling as she sang. He didn't tell anyone. He added the track to the capsule under a simple tag: Night Light, Track 0. Let it drift. Let it be found by silence someday. A week later, he noticed that Brian was slower than usual during their late afternoon listening session. The pianist paused midway through a song and stared at the keys like they'd rearranged themselves. "Where were we?" Brian asked gently. Elon didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. He watched Brian's face, calm, a little puzzled, not afraid, but softer. They went to the doctor 2 days later. Elon drove. Brian didn't speak during the ride. He just let the wind brush through the window, as if he were memorizing it. The visit was quiet. Routine tests. Simple questions. Some answers slipped away. On the drive back, Brian looked out the window and said, "If I forget who I was, let the music remind me." That night, Elon began something new. A series of recorded conversations, unstructured and intimate. He asked Brian about his first memory of harmony, about the day he knew he was a musician, about silence, regret, forgiveness. Brian answered slowly, sometimes with long pauses between words, sometimes by humming instead of speaking. Elon recorded it all, each pause, each sigh, even the silence. I think, Elon wrote in his notes that night, we are now archiving the soul, not just the sound. Soon, the capsule began collecting not just notes, but silences. Whole tracks of them, measured, layered, long enough to let the listener feel something unspoken. One of these tracks featured nothing but a faint breeze and the sound of Brian's breath after he'd finished playing a melody he couldn't name. Elon called it Stillness 4. And yet, life kept arriving. One day, a package arrived at SpaceX. Inside were strange objects, handmade wooden drums, bowls with stretched cloth, and metal rods suspended by wire. A group of deaf musicians from Denmark had sent their contribution, sound through vibration. Each piece created resonance the body could feel, not hear. They included a letter: "We heard you. In our own way. We wanted to answer." Brian held one of the instruments to his chest, struck the metal rod gently, and smiled. They listened, he said, just not with ears. Elon added the recordings to the capsule, but also recorded the instruments in their resting state. The quiet hum of potential, the waiting. In his journal, he wrote, "We are translating the human soul into waves, and it's beginning to speak back." One evening, Brian invited Elon to sit with him in his favorite room, where the sun melted through aged blinds. He took a breath and gestured toward the old tape machine. "Do you hear it?" he asked. Elon tilted his head. Brian pressed the rewind button. Not the notes, the space between them. That's where the feeling lives. The rest is just scaffolding. It took Elon a moment to hear it, but once he did, it never left him. To understand fully, he flew to the ocean. More precisely, to the exact stretch of beach where Brian had once scribbled the first fragments of heroes and villains. Elon walked alone before dawn, barefoot in the cold sand, carrying only a small field recorder. He captured the waves. Not the crashing ones, but the retreat, the sound of water pulling back, revealing the shoreline again. The sound of letting go. Then, without planning to, he tilted the mic down and recorded the sound of his own footsteps in the sand. 2 steps, then 3, then stillness. He added it to the capsule without title. Just the file name, return.wave. When he returned, he and Brian listened to the file together in the studio. It was short, just the ocean, then those measured steps, then silence. Neither of them spoke for minutes. Brian reached over and placed a hand on Elon's. A long pause. Then, gently, "We're getting close." Not close to finishing. Close to understanding what had always been there, floating beneath memory, beneath language. The capsule, once a vessel of curated culture, had become something quieter, deeper. A song not written in notation or words, but in breath, absence, closeness. A song meant not just for the stars, but for the ones left listening. The room was smaller than one might expect for something so monumental. No grand stage, no orchestral flerists, just low lighting, a semicircle of monitors, and a table lined with the final components of a message meant for the stars. The capsule, sleek, quiet, impossibly modest, sat open, waiting for its last element. Final mix complete. Encoding stable. Encryption elegant. But something still hovered in the air, like a note unresolved. Elon stood by the console, arms crossed. Behind him, Brian sat in an armchair, wrapped in a soft shawl, sipping tea. His eyes followed every movement. His breath was steady but slower now. His hands, once so quick on the piano, rested in his lap. "There's one more track," Elon said. Brian raised his eyebrows. "Another song?" Elon shook his head. "No, a space of sound, but not sound." He stepped closer to the input terminal, holding a small transducer in his hand. "Vibration only," he said. "No audible frequency, just the resonance. For anyone or anything that doesn't have ears, but might still feel." Brian smiled faintly. Sometimes what speaks loudest is what never tries to. They added the file. It bore no name, no length, just a frequency. A gentle hum the body could feel, but the mind would never grasp. And with that, the capsule was complete. The media had been circling for weeks. Stories spilled across the internet, speculations, think pieces, critics and romantics all debating what it meant for Earth to send not data, but emotion into the stars. At a quiet press conference, someone asked Elon the question that had been forming in many minds. Why Brian Wilson? Elon looked down, then up, his voice low and certain. Because he sang what I never knew how to say. There was no follow-up. Instead of more appearances, Elon spent the following days visiting the people who had, unknowingly, built the project alongside them. The letter writers, the lullaby singers, the whisperers of unspoken truths. In Phoenix, he met an 84-year-old woman named Delilah who had sent a cassette labeled for Harold. It was her voice, tremulous but strong, reading a letter she had once burned and regretted for decades. It ended with a line, "And thank you for waiting, even when I never returned." She also enclosed a short message for Brian, written in blue ink, "Your music saved my marriage. We danced to Don't Worry Baby, the night we almost left each other. We stayed. We danced. We forgave." When Elon read it aloud to Brian, the older man laughed gently, as if surprised by his own reach. "Tell her," he said, "that's the best review I've ever gotten." In Portland, Elon visited a boy named Luca, 10 years old, diagnosed with severe anxiety, mostly nonverbal. Yet he had memorized every track from the capsule by sequence, sound, and tone. His mother said the project had been the first thing he connected with in months. Luca stood before Brian, eyes wide, hands fidgeting. Then he opened his mouth and sang, softly, steadily, part of Warmth of the Sun. Brian's eyes filled. When the song ended, he leaned in, kissed Luca's forehead, and whispered, "You're the future we never saw coming, and I'm so glad you came." The launch date neared. At SpaceX, a simple ceremony was planned, nothing grand, by Elon's request. "Let it feel like a goodbye letter," he said, "not a press event." They gathered on the open observation deck near the launch tower. No stage, no speeches. Engineers, musicians, friends, and family sat in rows of folding chairs beneath a soft, gold-blue sky. The capsule rested in a transparent case on a stone pedestal, lit only by the sun beginning its descent. Brian, now more fragile, sat beside Elon. He had declined the offer to speak. "I just want to listen," he had said. "It's time I heard what others have to say." And so he listened. A youth choir stepped forward, children from around the country, many of whom had contributed to the project with voice, laughter, and letters. They sang Good Vibrations, stripped down and raw. No surf rock, no production, just voices, intertwined in harmony, rising like smoke into the sky. Some cried. Others just closed their eyes. When the final chord hung in the air, Elon stepped forward and opened the case. He lifted the capsule himself. Its weight surprised him, not because it was heavy, but because it felt real. So many dreams lived within it. So many memories. So many goodbyes. He carried it to the payload technician. Their eyes met in silent understanding. "It's ready," Elon said. Brian watched it go. Watched as the glass closed and the capsule disappeared into its chamber inside the spacecraft's core. Then he whispered, "It's not just sound. It's feeling embedded." The sun reached the edge of the sky. Long shadows stretched toward the desert. The air turned quiet. Elon and Brian sat side by side alone now. Two older boys, born in different worlds, bound by one. They didn't speak. The wind moved gently. And somewhere in the distance, the memory of a song drifted between them. The countdown began not with fanfare, but with silence. The final seconds flickered across the monitor in the SpaceX control room. 5, 4, 3. And no one spoke. Even the engineers, who had launched payloads heavier, louder, more complex, watched with stillness as a modest, glinting satellite lifted gently from Earth's embrace, carrying with it the smallest thing they'd ever sent, and the most human. Nestled within its frame was a black capsule no larger than a basketball. Contained inside, waveforms, breaths, lullabies, heartbreak, laughter. It had no thrusters, no sensors, no mission except to travel, to sing, and to remember. Elon Musk stood at the front of the room, his hands clasped behind his back. Beside him, in a wheelchair softly tucked under a navy shawl, was Brian Wilson. His hair now almost entirely silver, eyes clear but heavy with time. The capsule had left Earth, and so had a part of them both. The first transmission came 20 minutes later, bounced from the capsule into deep space simulators and relayed back to Earth. It was the start of the sequence. Elon had chosen it personally, or rather they had long ago, in a moment when words had failed and melody had filled the room like breath. "Don't talk, put your head on my shoulder," began to play. It came through the speakers not like a broadcast, but like a whisper across decades. The instrumentation floated, the vocals near ghostly. Not distorted, just softened by distance, wrapped in a layer of velvet nothingness that only space could give. Brian listened with his eyes closed, a small smile tugging at his lips. All across the globe, people listened. No narration, no captions, no subtitles or translations. Just that one song, transmitted into the void, Earth's quiet signature. In classrooms in Tokyo and Nairobi, in nursing homes in Oslo and Sao Paulo, children and elders gathered around small radios or school laptops to listen. Some knew the tune, others didn't. It didn't matter. In a small town in Nebraska, a sixth grader asked her teacher, "Why is it so slow and sad?" The teacher answered, "Because it's saying something we still don't have words for." Elon didn't speak for a long time after the playback ended. When he finally did, his voice was low and even. "This," he said, "is our love letter to eternity." Brian looked up, his voice a rasp wrapped in warmth. "I never thought I'd live long enough to hear our silence leave the earth." The days that followed were a kind of unfolding. Messages began arriving, tens of thousands. Not comments, not likes, but thank yous. Elderly couples who had danced to the Beach Boys on high school gym floors. Children who had heard their mother's voice in a lullaby for the first time. Artists who said the project reminded them of why they began creating in the first place. One letter, handwritten on yellow stationery, came from a lifelong friend of Brian's who had once toured with the band but never recorded. "You finally launched your last wave, brother, and it might just reach where the others never did." Brian smiled when he read it, not with pride, but with a kind of restful relief. Then came the podcast. It wasn't planned. A friend of Elon's invited them to record just a conversation. Nothing structured, no marketing, just two men in a room talking. They spoke for almost 2 hours. Elon, normally guarded, spoke softly about growing up in silence, about the impossibility of building emotion into circuitry, and about the first time music made him cry. Brian told stories he hadn't told in decades. About writing in my room in a moment of panic. About listening to his daughters breathe while recording harmonies. About fearing the silence and then growing to trust it. "I think," Brian said at one point, we don't actually remember songs. We remember how they made us feel when nothing else could. The episode ended not with credits, but with 10 full seconds of silence. Then, unexpected, unprompted, Brian laughed. Soft, simple, almost like a child. The world replayed that moment millions of times. Meanwhile, the capsule continued drifting. Not aimless, just unanchored. It began capturing radiation echoes, solar frequencies, atmospheric fragments, the gentle push and pull of gravitational hums. The project had never intended to receive, but it did. Elon sat late one evening, headphones on, listening to raw data filtered into audible range. Static, pulses, something like the flutter of a far-off current. And he recorded a message. Just one. If there is someone, anyone listening out there, know this, we loved. And we sang about it. Then came something Elon didn't expect. Brian, more fragile by the week, called him over and handed him a small, clear cassette case. Inside, a tape, unlabeled, only a handwritten note, play when I'm gone. Not before. Elon took it with both hands. He didn't ask what was on it. He didn't have to. He hugged Brian. Not the kind of hug meant for cameras or photos. The kind that holds you still when nothing else can. You, Elon said, voice low, you taught me how to listen for the first time. Brian's fingers pressed lightly against Elon's back, then slowly, gently let go. That night, as the stars emerged one by one beyond the windows of the observatory, the capsule continued on. It made no noise, but somehow the Earth felt quieter and more alive. Because of it, the house no longer buzzed with melodies. Not like before, but even in the stillness, the air held a kind of music, one that didn't come from pianos or tape decks, but from the memory of what had been created there. The curtains moved softly in the breeze. The walls, once lined with marked-up sheet music and analog gear, now carried only photographs and a quiet reverence. Brian Wilson, now frail, rested in his favorite chair near the window. His shawl draped loosely around his shoulders, and his hands, those hands that once shaped harmonies like sculptors carved stone, trembled gently in his lap. His voice had grown thinner, his walk shorter, but his eyes still had that curious, youthful glow. They followed the light as it shifted across the room, like a melody unspooling across an invisible staff. Elon Musk visited more often now, not with notebooks, not with recorders, just himself. Presence. He would sit for hours, sometimes reading aloud, sometimes saying nothing at all. Sometimes they would share a piece of fruit or a cup of tea, but mostly they just sat. Two men who had once launched a song into space, now grounded in something quieter. One afternoon, as the sky outside turned a gentle amber, Brian stirred and said, barely above a whisper, "Would you play it?" Elon turned. "The tape." Brian nodded. So Elon rose, walked to the shelf, and took the small digital unit that held the capsule's final recording, a master track composed of dozens of memories, woven together with pauses, laughter, silence, and that final vibrational note that no one could hear, but everyone seemed to feel. He pressed play. They didn't speak as the sounds filled the room. Laughter, wind, a heartbeat, a lullaby in Mapudungun. Brian's last piano solo, a child's recorded giggle, a woman whispering, "I forgive you." The soft echo of "Don't talk, put your head on my shoulder." It played like a prayer, not directed upward but outward toward the great unknown that had received their capsule, now adrift beyond the orbit of Mars. When the final note faded, Brian exhaled as though something had finally reached him. "That," he said, "is the farthest music has ever been from home." Elon reached over and gently took his hand. The skin was thin, warm, still music in the pulse beneath it. "Thank you," Elon said, voice tight, "for showing me what love sounds like when you don't need words." Brian smiled faintly. His fingers tightened just a little. Later that evening, Elon found a folded slip of paper on the piano bench, written in Brian's familiar hand, "For space with tenderness." That was all. Elon kept it, and when the time came, he made a quiet promise to transform this home, Brian's home, into something more than a house, into a sound archive, a sanctuary of resonance, not a museum, a place where music could breathe. He contacted preservationists and audio historians. He didn't want to digitize it into sterile files. He wanted to keep the floorboards that creaked, the rustle of the eucalyptus outside, the echo of piano hammers against strings. The whole house would become a living speaker. News traveled slowly, gently. One morning, headlines appeared. Brian Wilson enters palliative care, at peace, surrounded by sound. There was no frenzy, no sensationalism. Just a quiet, widespread acknowledgement of a man preparing to fade, wrapped in the very music he had helped shape the world with. And in response, the world played back. Across countries and continents, musicians held silent tributes. Not concerts, no microphones, just small gatherings on porches in nursing homes, in bedrooms where people picked up guitars, violins, harmoniums, and played acoustically. No applause, only gratitude. A cello sang in a garden in Kyoto. An accordion whispered in a kitchen in Lisbon. A boy played in my room on a music box in a village in Finland. No one was watching, and yet everyone was. Letters poured into Elon's office, hundreds, then thousands. Thank you for letting music live in space. He helped me find my voice. Now I listen differently. My father and I made peace listening to the capsule. Elon read every one, then folded them gently and brought them to Brian's home. He placed them in a wooden box labeled Returns. One morning, Brian asked for a song. Not a new one, an old one. Elon understood. He found the original recording of God Only Knows, untouched, warm and breathing with the imperfections of reel-to-reel. He played it through a small speaker by the window. Brian listened, eyes closed. When the last harmonies faded into quiet, he whispered, "I still don't know," and smiled. A nurse appeared at the doorway sometime after sunset, carrying a small tape deck. She looked to Elon for confirmation. He nodded. It was the tape Brian had given Elon months earlier, the one he had never played. She inserted it gently. There was no music, just the faint sound of birds, followed by a young voice, Brian's own, recorded decades ago. "If I forget someday, tell me I was kind." Brian didn't respond, but he reached for Elon's hand and held it. That night, Elon sat in his car outside the house for a long time, the same tape now in his hands. He didn't press play. Not yet. He just held it, as if the warmth in the plastic might carry one more note, one more breath, one last echo of the man who had taught him what only music could say. By the time the Interstellar Sound Capsule had settled into its silent trajectory beyond the orbit of Mars, the world below had grown louder, not in noise, but in meaning. The capsule songs had begun their slow ripple through Earth, not by force or publicity, but by resonance. First, through curiosity, then reverence, and now through belonging. It started in schools. In Italy, a language arts teacher played a recording from a capsule, a Ukrainian grandmother humming a lullaby, and asked her students to draw what the sound reminded them of. The class filled with images of blankets, porches, shadows in doorways. In Nairobi, a group of students danced barefoot to a track made of laughter and wind. They didn't know where it came from, but they said it felt like home. In Finland, an ethics professor rewrote an entire semester around one question: if we could send our humanity into the universe, what would we choose to leave behind? The class used capsule recordings as case studies. They debated silence, forgiveness, and the memory of sound. And still, the letters kept arriving. A widow in Saskatchewan wrote, "I heard my husband's whistle in one of the songs. I know it wasn't him, but for a moment it was." A grandfather in Indonesia said, "I wept when I heard the lullaby. My daughter used to sing that before she passed. I had forgotten the sound of her voice. And then I remembered." Elon read these messages with a growing stillness inside him. He had built machines meant to go farther than any human ever had. And yet here, in this simple vessel of sound, he had stumbled into something greater, a return. He visited Brian that same week, bringing with him a new documentary created by a group of university students from Brazil and South Korea. It was simply titled Echoes. They watched it together in Brian's dim living room, the curtains drawn against a soft gray sky. The documentary was raw, stitched together with shaky footage and voiceovers in multiple languages. Children in classrooms holding hands. An old woman pressing a speaker to her chest. A boy describing how his stutter faded when he sang one of the capsule's songs. Brian watched without blinking. When it ended, he said only, "They understood," without needing to explain. The following morning, Elon received an official invitation from the Secretary General of the United Nations. "Would you present the Interstellar Capsule at the next General Assembly?" He looked at the letter for a long time before setting it aside. "No," he said quietly to his team. "This isn't about me." But when Brian heard, he shook his head with a tired but knowing smile. "Elon," he said, "you're the only one who knows what it felt like to hear the silence before all this." And so Elon said yes, but not yet. First, he had another visit to make. At a public school in New Orleans, a teacher named Celeste had developed a groundbreaking experiment using tactile balloons to transmit capsule frequencies to deaf children. The balloons, filled with a gel-like substance, captured the resonance of the music in vibration. Children placed their hands on them and felt songs bloom beneath their palms. Elon stood quietly at the back of the classroom as the children listened. One girl, no older than 7, closed her eyes and smiled wide as she felt the rhythm of waves. Another began to sway with the beat of a lullaby. A third boy pressed his cheek to the balloon and said something in sign that made the interpreter weep. Afterward, Elon recorded a short video message for Brian. "They hear it," he said, voice catching. "Just differently, and maybe more deeply than we ever could." He sent the video without commentary. Brian never replied in words. But the next day, when Elon arrived with soup and silence, he found Brian already at the record player, waiting, expecting, smiling. Time moved slower now for Brian. He rested more, spoke less. But every few days, he would insist on listening to something. Not always from a capsule. Sometimes just an old jazz record. Sometimes birds outside. And still, he asked, "Play me something that remembers." One afternoon, Elon brought him a new contribution, a recording from senior choir in Manchester. 30 voices aged 70 to 92, singing a soft, fragile version of "In My Room." The harmonies weren't perfect. Some voices wavered, others broke, but the feeling in them, it rang with the unmistakable sound of memory. Brian listened, motionless, then whispered, "Sounds like they made a home." That evening, as Elon helped tuck a blanket over Brian's legs, he realized something. He had always thought the capsule was a gesture of departure, of sending something out into the cosmos to say we were here. But now, he saw it differently. It wasn't about saying goodbye. It was about carrying people back to each other, across silence, across time, across lifetimes. In hospitals and classrooms, in homes and headphones, the capsule had become a soft landing, a mirror held to humanity not to show its image, but its sound. And in that echo, something had been returned. Something that no machine could have built. A feeling, a voice, a memory that floated back home. The morning was clear, the sky so vividly blue it felt painted. At the gates of the archival building, a modest wooden glass structure nestled beside a grove of sycamores, dozens of families began to gather. Some arrived with children clinging to their hands, others with canes or rolling suitcases full of mementos. They had come from all over the world, following one invitation. It had been Elon's idea, a quiet event, no press, no speeches, just an open door. Those who had sent recordings, letters, whispers, breath, pieces of themselves for the Interstellar Capsule were now invited to listen. Inside, the air was soft with sound. Not music playing out loud, but vibrations held in glass-walled rooms, accessible through headphones and small listening stations. Each file bore a date, a title, sometimes a name. Most just said, "For the one who remembers." In one corner, a young woman paused, head tilted. Then she gasped, quietly, reverently, and placed a hand over her mouth. "Na-na," she whispered, tears brimming. She had found a recording of her grandmother singing a folk melody from the hills of southern Italy. The older woman had passed 3 winters earlier. The granddaughter hadn't known the lullaby had been sent. But the moment it played, her voice, the exact rhythm of her breath, time folded, and the past walked beside her once more. Elon, standing a few feet away, watched. He didn't speak, didn't interrupt. He simply observed, arms loosely folded, his expression unreadable and tender. Around the room, similar scenes played out like old films. A man recognizing his daughter's giggle in a layer of ambient sound, an elderly couple holding hands as a violin looped faintly behind their silence, a child pressing headphones against her heart, not her ears. For Elon, it wasn't pride he felt. It was something quieter. Permission to feel, to remember, to be changed by something you helped send into space, only to find that it had somehow stayed here too. But Brian wasn't there. He had asked not to come. "I'm too tired for crowds," he said with a small smile. "Let them hear each other without my shadow." Still at home, his record player was ready. Elon had arranged for a live relay from the archive to Brian's speakers. The music wouldn't be loud. It would come like wind beneath a door. And so, as the voices of those who had contributed began to hum softly across the archive, Brian sat in his chair, shawl over his shoulders, tea cooling beside him, and closed his eyes. He smiled. Later that evening, after most guests had gone, Elon sat in a quiet booth and recorded a brief audio message, not for the capsule, not for media, but for Brian himself. He kept his voice low, his words slow. He taught me to hear what wasn't said, what didn't ask. He taught me to listen to things we usually walk past, like grief, like stillness, like love too shy to speak. The message was transmitted to Brian's player that same night. He didn't say anything in reply, but he listened, and that was enough. Weeks passed gently, and then came something unexpected. A folder marked incoming appeared in the capsule's ground station logs, signals from deep space mission crews, compressed and encrypted. Messages of return. One was from a crew aboard an interplanetary vessel conducting sleep and stress studies beyond lunar orbit. Their capsule had been equipped with a duplicate transmission module. The astronaut's message was simple. "I heard my father's voice again tonight. Not a recording, not a memory, just real. I slept deeper than I ever have in space." When Brian heard the transmission, he asked only one thing: to play it for me before bed. That night, Elon sat beside him once again. The voice echoed across the room like a dream. The tape ended with quiet static. Brian leaned back, the faintest smile tracing his lips. Elon, watching, felt the words rise but left them unspoken. He knew Brian was starting to say goodbye. Not loudly, not suddenly, just gently pulling away, like a tide receding. And in response, Elon began planning something new. A terrestrial archive. A public, walk-in version of the capsule's collection. Free, simple, quiet. A place not just to hear, but to feel. He didn't call it a museum. He called it a listening house. Designed in a circle, the building would hold sound chambers lined with memory foam and soft light. Visitors could select recordings from the capsule or upload their own. Songs, laughter, messages. The air would not echo but embrace. Before finalizing the plans, Elon sent the blueprints to Brian, now mostly bedridden. 3 days later, a response came. Not a long letter, just a single note. "Make sure there's enough silence between the songs. That's part of the melody too." Elon smiled when he read it, because now he understood. Silence wasn't the absence of sound. It was the space that made sound matter. It was the breath before goodbye, the pause after "I love you," the stillness of someone holding your hand and saying nothing because nothing needed to be said. And in that stillness, Brian had always been singing. There was no ribbon cutting, no flashbulbs, no celebrity speeches. The museum opened like a breath, quiet, reverent, unnoticed by most of the world. It didn't even call itself a museum. The plaque beside the door simply read, "The Listening House, for those who remember and those who hope to." Set within a circle of olive trees on the edge of a coastal bluff, the structure was made of warm wood, stone, and silence. Its design evoked both chapel and home, arched ceilings, thick walls that held warmth and quiet. Inside, there were no spotlights, no glass display cases, no maps or audio guides, just sound. Each room held a single recording. One, carefully selected, carefully placed. A bench, a small plaque, a pair of headphones, and a drawer beneath where visitors could leave something of their own. A letter, a drawing, a photo, a folded note they hadn't had the courage to give someone in time. Within days, the drawers began to fill. A boy left a scribbled crayon note, "I forgive you, Dad." A woman placed a snapshot of her wedding beside a recording of rain on a tin roof. An old man wrote only, that sewing machine was hers. "Thank you for remembering." Elon watched this last man stoop gray, his eyes red as he sat alone in a booth listening to the soft mechanical rhythm of a 1950s Singer sewing machine. It had been one of the earliest contributions to the capsule, submitted anonymously. Elon didn't speak, but the way the man wept, silently, fully, said everything. From his home, not far away, Brian followed the opening with a kind of quiet pride. He no longer left the house. His walks were limited to the rooms where music still lived, his piano room, the hallway of gold-tinged records, the sun porch with its ever-fading armchair. But his mind, when present, remained sharp in bursts. He listened to the ambient recordings of the listening house with deep attention. One day, as the sound of a cello swelled through the living room speakers, he murmured, "It sings through what we didn't say." Elon visited every few days now, never with an agenda, sometimes just with soup, other times with a new track someone had left, or a letter, or a piece of music improvised on the museum's old upright piano, left there by a visiting traveler. One afternoon, a reporter asked Elon a simple question as he stood outside the museum under a low sky. "Was this for you or for all of us?" Elon paused, then answered softly, "It was for what we forget to keep." Inside, in one of the open chambers, a retired ballerina had returned after years. No family, no guests, just herself, and the echo of Surfer Girl playing softly from a nearby wall speaker. She danced, slowly, carefully. Her body didn't move like it once had, but her memory did. Her arms traced patterns only she could see. Her feet remembered steps even her joints had forgotten. Elon stood in the doorway. He didn't interrupt. He only whispered. Brian would understand. Later that week, a young woman brought her cello and asked for permission to play. Permission was never needed, but she asked anyway. She sat in the central chamber, surrounded by widows from a local retirement home, and played a piece that was not part of the capsule. It was hers, written in mourning, played in joy, offered in silence. When she finished, the women stood, not in applause, but in gratitude. This, Elon realized, was what the listening house had become. A place for people who no longer had someone to talk to, but still wanted to listen. Back at home, Brian had begun recording again. Not music, not melodies, but thoughts, reflections, small audio letters he labeled footnotes of the soul. "These aren't instructions," he said in one, "just shadows left by the light I walked through." He talked about the space between chords, the hesitation before a note, the way silence could sometimes be the only honest answer. Elon stored each message carefully, not on a cloud, not in a vault, but on physical tapes. One by one, he numbered and shelved them. They sat beside the original capsule backups, soft reminders that not all goodbyes came with closure. Some were meant to be revisited. He knew now that the end was drawing near, not in a dramatic way, not with final words or cinematic pauses, but in the way Brian's voice softened with each visit, in the way his hands no longer reached for the piano, in the way he now fell asleep mid-conversation, as if the body had finally learned to let go. One evening, as Elon sat by the window with him, listening to the low hum of the tape player in the corner, Brian stirred. He looked toward Elon, not with urgency, not with fear, just with knowing. "It's all there now," he said. Elon nodded, too full to speak. Brian smiled faintly. "Now it's you who listens for me." And that was it. No fanfare, no farewell. Just two men, in a quiet room, surrounded by echoes that would never be lost. By then, the visits had fallen into a rhythm as gentle as breath. Every afternoon, like clockwork untouched by obligation, Elon Musk arrived at Brian Wilson's home, not with folders, not with plans or questions. Only presence. He came empty-handed, save for a small thermos of tea and the quiet respect that builds only between two people who no longer need to speak to understand each other. The house had grown even quieter, if such a thing were possible. The once vibrant music room, once filled with tape hiss and the soft chaos of creativity, now rested like a library at dusk. The piano stood untouched but tuned. The record player, used but clean. Sunlight filtered in through sheer curtains, tracing soft lines across the floor. Dust floated like memory in the stillness. Brian had moved permanently to the sunroom by now, his favorite chair position just so to catch the golden light of a late afternoon. He had grown noticeably thinner, his skin more transparent at the temples. But his eyes still searched the air as if chasing echoes only he could hear. They would sit for hours, sometimes sipping their tea in silence, sometimes listening to the wind move through the olive branches outside. Words, when they came, were brief, low, and spaced like the rests in a lullaby. One day, as the light dimmed into a deeper amber, Brian gestured gently to the old reel-to-reel player by the cabinet. "Play it," he said, "the capsule, with the notes." Elon nodded. He retrieved the master edition of the Interstellar Sound Capsule, the version interwoven with Brian's voice, his thoughts recorded months earlier. Elon threaded the tape with care, pressed play, and sat down again beside his friend. The room filled with voices, tones, layers of sound older than memory. A lullaby in a fading dialect. Ocean waves retreating on stone. A child laughing. A single breath before saying goodbye. But this time, Brian didn't speak. No comments, no footnotes. No smiles or reactions. He simply closed his eyes, folded his hands, and listened. Elon watched him in profile. Watched how the light from the window softened the edges of his face. Watched how stillness became its own kind of presence. He knew, then, that the work was finished. Not with ceremony or final lines, but in this, one man listening to what he helped create without the need to add anything more. Later that week, during a visit under a soft gray sky, Brian handed Elon a small envelope, plain, aged, sealed with a single piece of yellowing tape. It was thin but firm, and inside Elon could feel the circular weight of a vinyl single. It didn't rattle. It rested. Brian didn't look at him when he spoke. Play it when you don't know what to say. Elon didn't ask what was on the record. He didn't open it in front of him. He didn't have to. He placed it gently inside his coat pocket, close to his chest. That evening, they listened to nothing at all. No music. No tape. Only wind. Only time. A few days later, after pouring tea with careful hands, Elon asked quietly, all these years of writing music, trying to say something true, do you think one song could ever really say it? Brian took a long sip of tea, then exhaled through his nose. One song, he said, can say what 1,000 voices can't, because it doesn't ask to be understood. It just is. Elon nodded. And what do you think it says? Brian's mouth curled in the faintest of smiles. That we were human, he said, and that was enough. The next afternoon, Elon found Brian asleep in his chair when he arrived. The tea tray was untouched, the record player silent. Sunlight drifted across the hardwood in long, pale streaks. The entire house felt as if it were holding its breath. He didn't wake him. Instead, Elon moved slowly through the house until he reached the piano room. He sat down on the bench, ran a finger across the top of the keys without pressing. Then, quietly, reverently, he opened a drawer and removed a small cassette labeled simply, 1. It was the first piece Brian had recorded for the capsule. A simple piano improvisation, soft and halting. No accompaniment. No edits, just fingers speaking to ivory. Hesitant, then certain, then fading. Elon placed the cassette into the player, pressed play, and listened. The sound filled the air like a breath held just long enough to tremble. The notes weren't complex, but they carried weight, the kind only love, longing, and time could give. Outside, the wind shifted. The curtains swayed. Light moved across the floor like the slow turning of a page. And Elon, sitting at the old piano with his hands resting on his knees, didn't move. He let the music play. Let's say what words could not. Behind him, the house creaked softly. A floorboard whispered. Somewhere, a branch tapped the window pane. Brian remained asleep in the other room, still breathing, still present. But Elon understood. This was the last note before the last note. The final pause before the final phrase. And in that pause, in the hush between two men who had built a song large enough to reach space, but quiet enough to hold soul, there was no fear. Only gratitude, only love, only the sound of silence, which by now, they both knew, was music. It was early June when the call came. The sun hadn't fully risen, and the sky was that pale, in-between color that didn't belong to either night or day. Elon Musk sat in his study, not working, just watching light pool slowly onto the floorboards. His phone rang once. He answered. There were no questions, no protests, no surprise. The voice on the other end said only, he passed away peacefully this morning. At home, in his chair. Elon's reply was barely audible. I understand. Then the line went quiet. He stood for a long time, unmoving, until the shadows on the wall shifted and reminded him it was time to go. Driving to Brian's house felt different now. The roads were familiar, but the destination was not. The man who had once waited for him by the window, who nodded instead of speaking, who listened instead of filling silence, was no longer there. The house greeted him like a memory, still intact, still scented faintly of old paper, tea, and oak, but no longer breathed. Elon walked through the room slowly, as one walks through the final pages of a well-loved book. There were no signs of distress, only stillness, only absence. In the music room, the piano remained untouched, its lid half open as if waiting. Scattered across the top were sheets of paper, unlined, worn at the corners, each bearing a few handwritten notes in soft graphite. Some were full staves, others just a single measure, a half-finished chord, or a phrase in the margin. Let it linger here, pause before truth. Above the keys, resting against a framed photo of the beach at Santa Monica, lay an envelope. It was addressed in that unmistakable handwriting, slightly leaning forward as if straining to finish the message. To Elon when I'm gone. He opened it slowly. Inside was a letter, no more than 5 lines. You listened. That was enough. You tuned my ending like a friend who knew what silence meant. Thank you for hearing the parts one couldn't play. You made the last note whole. Below that, no signature. Just a drawn treble clef, faint and incomplete. Elon held the letter for a moment, folded it carefully, and placed it in his coat. He didn't cry. Not then. Instead, he walked into the kitchen and stood by the old porcelain sink. The room hadn't changed. The same clock ticked in half-beats. A chipped mug still held 2 pencils near the window. The tea kettle sat untouched. Elon stayed there, still, listening. Then, softly from the back room, the old record player, left on in the sunroom, began to spin. Love and Mercy. The melody floated through the empty house, unannounced. It sounded smaller than usual, like it knew it wasn't being played for company, just for presence. The world, meanwhile, stirred. Word spread quickly. Tributes began pouring in from every corner of the globe. Fans, musicians, historians, astronauts, children, strangers who had once sent recordings to the capsule. Social media filled with clips of Brian's interviews, his harmonies, his silences. Public parks played his music on speakers. Candlelit vigils sprang up in neighborhoods that hadn't known his name the week before, but knew what he made them feel. But Elon said nothing. He didn't release a statement. He didn't sit for interviews. He stayed in the house, alone, For 3 days, he did the work no one else could, carefully cataloging the last notes, files, and fragments Brian had left behind. There were tapes marked only with dates, snippets of melody, snatches of laughter, a single track with Brian simply humming, forgetting the lyrics, and then laughing at himself. That laugh, warm, unguarded, utterly human, became the final piece. Elon encoded it as the epilogue to the Interstellar Sound Capsule. It was uploaded not with fanfare but with reverence. And once it was done, he took a thin-tip pen and wrote a final line into the official capsule archive. What he didn't say, he sang. And that is more than enough. At SpaceX headquarters, the team gathered without ceremony. No speeches, no slides. Just 1 minute, 60 heartbeats of silence, as the Mars outpost confirmed it had begun replaying the capsule's soundtrack in full orbit. A soundscape not of technology, but of tenderness. A reminder that even in the vacuum of space, humanity had managed to leave something behind that pulsed with emotion. As the minute passed in the corner of the lab, a young intern sat down at an old electric keyboard. Without prompting, he began to play. God only knows. The notes weren't perfect. The chords trembled, but no one stopped him. The room listened. No longer engineers or executives, just people remembering someone who taught them how to hear. That night, long after the building had emptied, Elon stepped out into the open sky. The air was crisp, the stars unusually clear. Above him, somewhere too far to see, the capsule sailed on, unchained, undirected, unafraid. He looked up for a long time, as if waiting for something. A reply, a sound, but there was only silence. And then gently he spoke. "Good night, Brian." No answer came, but the stars seemed for a moment to hum. Months passed, but the capsule didn't fall silent. Now far beyond Mars' orbit, it traveled with steady grace through the velvet dark. A thread of music, drifting quietly through space like a prayer with no destination. Some nights, Elon imagined the songs bending faintly around the moons of Jupiter, brushing past Saturn's rings, echoing somewhere in the hush between stars. At the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, a young scientist noticed something strange in the audio return logs, a soft reverberation that didn't match any known reflection. The waveforms formed a delicate signature, not quite distortion, not quite echo. When he brought the data to Elon, eyes lit with wonder, Elon studied it in silence. He didn't ask for analysis, didn't ask for simulation. Instead, he said gently, maybe it reached something. Maybe someone's listening. In Earth's quiet corners, the legacy was growing. Schools began integrating the capsule's content into their music and literature curricula, not as a scientific achievement, but as a human one. In a rural classroom in Norway, children closed their eyes while a teacher played a lullaby from Chile. This, she whispered, was sung by a grandmother who never met her grandson, but she sent her voice to the stars. In a nursing home in Kentucky, an old man sat with his granddaughter, headphones over both their ears, listening to the rhythm of a sewing machine recorded decades earlier. "That's your great-grandmother's," he said, voice trembling. I'd forgotten what it sounded like. At the Sound Archive, now a global heritage site, people came not to tour, but to listen. There were no bright screens, just low chairs, soft speakers, handwritten notes beside each recording. A worn photo here, a child's drawing there. Voices that had once been ignored or lost now had a home. They had weight, meaning, memory. A young violinist from Lisbon released an album inspired by the capsule. She titled it Mar Interior, the Inner Sea. Her melodies moved like tides, borrowing from lullabies and silence, stitching grief and gratitude into every bow stroke. When Elon listened to it alone, he didn't speak for hours. Then he wrote a letter to Brian's family. He gave me more than music. He gave me the courage to listen to what I had spent a lifetime avoiding. The world had changed quietly, reverently. A global festival emerged, the Sound of Earth, held every spring. Not a spectacle, a vigil. Families gathered to share recordings, stories, and songs. In one ceremony, a theater full of strangers sat together as Brian's private recording, The one he gave to Elon in an envelope marked for when words fail was played. The piece lasted 34 minutes. No one spoke. When the final note faded, they stood in silence. Then slowly applause. Not thunderous, but warm, like hands finding each other after darkness. Elon, who had once avoided the spotlight of sentiment, began to write. He penned the introduction to a book titled Music for a Solitary Planet. The book told the story of the capsule, of Brian, of what it meant to carry beauty into the cosmos, not to conquer it, but to keep us company. In his foreword, Elon wrote, "He taught me to listen to what was never said. And in doing so, I heard myself for the first time." The United Nations officially recognized the capsule as a symbol of peace and planetary kinship. Not a monument of technology, but of tenderness. Inside the capsule floated not just songs, but apologies, thanks, memories, and wishes, human moments crystallized in sound. Years after the first launch, a final capsule was prepared. Much smaller, minimalist. Its contents, 3 simple sounds. The ocean, laughter, silence. When asked why, Elon answered, "Because in the end, that's what remains." On the anniversary of the launch, Elon visited the same beach where he once recorded Brian's steps in the sand. He came alone. No press, no security, only a small satchel, the tide, and the sky. He sat on a weathered bench, waves humming at his feet. In his hands, the final vinyl, the one Brian gave him years earlier. He had never played it, not until now. As the record turned on a small portable player, a melody began. Soft, familiar. Then a pause. Then Brian's voice, fragile but luminous. "If someone's listening, we were here. We tried. We loved. And we sang about it." Elon closed his eyes. Above him, stars flickered, ancient and indifferent. But in that hush, somewhere between the tide and the sky, music rose. Still playing, still human. And now, dear viewer, I want to hear from you. If this story stirred something inside you, a memory, a moment, a song, please share it in the comments. I read every one with care. Sometimes the most beautiful echoes are the ones we leave in each other.